Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a really pretty unexpected legal battleground. It involves the Trump administration's, well, recent actions targeting Harvard University.
Yeah, and it's surprising because it's not the usual focus, like admissions debates. We're talking about something different here. Challenges to Harvard's ability to host international students, even its tax-exempt status.
Exactly. Things you don't normally see questioned, certainly not all at once.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is just the sheer scope of it. Freezing billions in federal research money, going after their tax exemption, trying to block international students.
And it really paints a picture, doesn't it? Like a very determined campaign almost against one university.
Yeah, full court press, you might say.
Right. But here's the twist. Despite how aggressive it sounds, these legal moves haven't really been working out in court. They're facing setbacks.
Significant ones.
So our mission today is really to understand why. Why are these attempts, these pretty major attempts, kind of faltering? What are the underlying issues?
Well, looking at the information we've got, it seems they pursued this on, three main fronts.
Okay.
First, as you mentioned, trying to freeze a whole load of federal research funding. Billions of things.
Huge numbers.
Okay, what else? Second, a really significant step, trying to actually revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status. That's a big one.
Wow. Yeah, that cuts deep.
And third, maybe the one with the most immediate sort of campus impact, trying to block thousands of international students from coming.
Okay, so funding, taxes, students. A broad attack. And the motivation, what does the source material suggest there?
It points towards, well, a sense of retaliation, maybe. The idea seems to be that the administration saw Harvard and maybe other places like it as part of an elitist camp and opponent.
Right. And us versus them kind of dynamic playing out through legal means. Okay, so let's dig in. If these attempts are failing, what exactly went wrong with the legal strategy?
Well, if we look at it through the lens of administrative law, how government agencies are supposed to work, a pattern emerges. A lot of the setbacks seem to boil down to problems with the process itself.
The process, not the actual substance of the policies.
Not initially, no. Take the international student issue, for example. The Department of Homeland Security, under Secretary Noem at the time, tried to roll out this major policy change really quickly, with very little warning.
Ah, okay. The sources suggest it was pretty sudden, right? And I guess that's where the legal trouble started.
Exactly. A judge stepped in quite fast, U.S. District Judge Allison Burroughs. She issued a temporary restraining order.
Okay, and why did she do that? What was the legal basis?
Well, this is the really key part. It wasn't at that stage about these big constitutional questions, First Amendment, free speech, due process, that sort of thing.
Really? So they didn't even need to get into all that?
Not at first. The ruling focused on much more fundamental procedural grounds. Basically, the argument was that the administration just hadn't followed the basic legal rules for making such a big change.
Okay, now that's interesting. So the courts could sort of sidestep the potentially huge constitutional debates because there were issues with the paperwork, essentially, in the process.
That's often how it works, yeah. Courts usually prefer to decide cases on the narrowest possible grounds. If there's a procedural error, that's often cleaner, legally speaking, than diving into complex constitutional territory. And here, the administration's missteps gave the court a clear path.
So what specific rules, what procedures did they overlook? What were the key mistakes?
The sources point to a few things. First, a lack of proper notice. Harvard wasn't formally told this was coming or given a real chance to respond before the policy hit.
Okay, no heads up. What else?
Second, it seems they don't provide enough evidence, like proof that Harvard had actually done anything wrong regarding the existing visa rules to justify such a drastic action.
So no proper warning, not enough evidence presented. Anything else?
Yes, and this is crucial. The Administrative Procedure Act. The APA.
Ah, the APA. We keep hearing about that. Why is that such a big deal here?
Well, the APA is basically the rule book for federal agencies. When they want to make significant policy changes, regulations, that kind of thing, the APA says how they have to do it. It ensures a level of, fairness and transparency.
Like giving notice, allowing people to comment.
Exactly. Notice, comment periods, justifying the rule based on evidence. These kinds of steps. The administration's actions, particularly on the student visa issue, seem to skip over some of these requirements, and that failure became a really central part of the legal challenge against them.
And this wasn't the first time, right?
Yeah.
The sources mentioned other instances where the Trump administration ran into similar problems.
That's right. It does raise a question about a potential pattern. Cases involving DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, and also the attempt to add a citizenship question to the census.
I remember those.
Yeah. In those cases, too, the courts ultimately found that the administration hadn't followed the correct procedures laid out by laws like the APA. They didn't cross their T's and dot their I's, legally speaking.
So it suggests a recurring issue with how these policy changes were being implemented, maybe a disregard for the procedural steps required.
It certainly suggests a challenge in making sure policy changes stuck legally because the process wasn't always followed correctly.
Now, Harvard wasn't alone in fighting this, was it? Did other groups join in?
No, they weren't alone. Harvard obviously mounted its own defense, but significantly, the Harvard chapter of the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, also joined the legal effort.
Okay, so faculty getting involved too.
Right, and that kind of collective action underscores that the concerns went beyond just Harvard's administration. It was seen as potentially affecting the broader academic community.
And did the court seem to recognize those broader potential impacts?
Absolutely. Judge Burroughs, in her ruling on the student visa issue, specifically mentioned the potential for really significant harm to thousands of students, obviously, but also to Harvard's research programs and even to the wider academic environment in the U.S.
So the potential real-world consequences were definitely on the court's mind.
It seems so. That understanding of the stakes likely played a role in the decision to grant that initial relief. And there are also suggestions that it wasn't just Harvard. Allegedly, law firms like Perkins Coie and Jenner and Block, known for representing clients critical of the administration, were also targeted, suggesting maybe a broader pattern.
Interesting. So where does all this leave things now? The administration's first attempts got blocked on procedural grounds? Is that the end of the story?
Not necessarily, no. The sources are clear that Harvard still has those bigger constitutional arguments in its back pocket, so to speak.
The First Amendment due process claims.
Exactly. Those haven't really been tested in court yet in this specific context. They remain potential avenues for future legal battles if things were to escalate again or take a different form. But for now, these initial rulings really highlight just how important those procedural requirements are and how failing to meet them created major hurdles for the administration's approach.
So, if we boil it down, the main takeaway seems to be that this major push against Harvard stumbled right out of the gate, not because the ideas themselves were necessarily unconstitutional yet, but because they didn't follow the basic rules of the road for how government agencies have to act.
That's a good way to put it. The courts didn't even need to reach those massive constitutional questions in these initial stages. The failure to give proper notice, show enough evidence of wrongdoing, and stick to the Administrative Procedure Act, that was enough.
It's almost an unexpectedly mundane reason for such a high-profile conflict to stall, isn't it? Procedure matters.
It absolutely does. It's fundamental to how administrative law works and acts as a check on executive action.
Okay, so let's quickly summarize then. We've seen the Trump administration launch these broad attacks on Harvard, hitting research funds, tax status, international students likely motivated by a view of Harvard as an elitist opponent.
Right, a multi-pronged effort.
But these efforts have largely been stopped, at least for now, in court. And the primary reason: procedural errors, failing to follow the steps required by laws like the Administrative Procedure Act.
Yep, issues with notice, evidence, and following the rulebook. A pattern seen in other administration cases, too, like DACA and the census.
And the courts, responding to challenges from Harvard and groups like the AAUP, recognized the potential harm and intervened based on these procedural flaws without needing to rule yet on the bigger constitutional claims.
Exactly. Those constitutional arguments are still out there, potentially, but the immediate story is about the power of procedure.
So it really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What does it mean when major government actions get tripped up, not necessarily on their substance, but on the how?
That's the provocative thought, I think. Does this emphasis on procedure highlight its importance as a safeguard? Or does it sometimes prevent decisive action? And what does it tell you, our listener, about the checks and balances in the system when process itself becomes the battleground?
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for walking through this complicated but really fascinating legal situation with us.
My pleasure.
Until our next deep dive, keep questioning.